Hello, good afternoon. I am Sawyer Miller. I appreciate everyone's time. Thank you guys for joining part 4 of our ISO 27001 webinar series. Today we're going to be talking about basically a simplified review of ISO 27001. The goal is to recap what the standard is, give you the understanding of how to think about it, how it breaks down. But it's also to acquaint you with some of the changes that have come about with some of the 27001 updates that were just released. So we've covered quite a bit in our prior 3 sessions. If you've not had an opportunity to watch those, I encourage you to go sign up for those. Even though they've already happened, you can still get a recording of those webinars. But those dive into a lot of the more granular details of how to get certified, time commitments, departments, responsibilities, how do you keep a program going, stuff like that. So this is our attempt at sort of zooming back out to give everyone an opportunity to see just a simplified review of the standard. So we'll start with the 27001 document. So if you don't have these documents, you're thinking about building a program, that's where you want to start. You want to go out to ISO.org and search for 27001, and you can find the actual document there. The document basically is made of 2 major sections. There's the clauses 4 through 10, which cover the non-negotiable governance requirements for the program, basically the elements of how you're going to build and structure and oversee the security program that makes up your ISMS, as well as the Annex A controls down here at the bottom. Those Annex A controls are basically the security controls that you'll implement in order to reduce risk identified in clause 6 down to an acceptable level. So what you're looking at here is the ISO 27001 2013 version. It's been out for quite some time. It's been reviewed a few times. There were a couple of more minor updates made to it. But recently, on October 25th, the 2022 version of ISO 27001 was released. So this is what it looks like now. So I would encourage you, if you're getting started for the very first time, to just start with this standard. I wouldn't really go back to the 2013 version. If you're on 2013 currently, don't worry, you're going to have plenty of time to move over to the new standard. The IAF has given guidance to ANAB and UCAS, which are the 2 main accreditation bodies that certify your external auditors that are issuing your certificate. When they issued guidance that said companies who are already certified today against the 2013 version will have 3 years to transition. So if you're in that boat, you have plenty of time, but you do need to go ahead and, there's no reason to wait. Go ahead and download this document, pay the $100 or so it takes, and start reviewing it. You'll notice that the main changes are really some additional detail. There was like a minor change in clause 6, just sort of a wording thing to clarify something. And then there was some additional guidance added down in clause 9 around the internal audit and the management review. But for the most part, clauses 4 through 10 is largely the same. There's no like major revision or addition or subtraction to clauses 4 through 10. So again, if you have a program that's operating today, just familiarize yourself with some of the additional language. There might be a few things you need to add to that governance structure, but overall it's fairly minor. The biggest change comes in at the Annex A control set, and we'll talk about what those changes are. So if you're not familiar, 27001, again, let me go back here. If you see the bottom of this document, this is the 27001 table of contents. There's the Annex A controls. Basically, it's a list of suggested controls to implement to reduce the risk identified in clause 6. But there's a supplemental document called ISO 27002 that gives you implementation guidance for each of those controls. So in Annex A, it simply states what each of the controls are. In this document, you'll get a page or more of guidance per control on things you need to think about, how you should implement this, what right looks like, what considerations the organization should make when you're thinking about these controls. There's most of the detail around the security controls you'll spend a lot of time implementing are going to be found in this document. So between 27001 and 27002, you have the set of requirements with the suggested controls and the implementation guidance for the security control set. There's also another document, 27003, that's implementation guidance on the clauses 4 through 10. But I find a lot of people are able to implement clauses 4 through 10 without that document. So not a bad one to go download and take a look at. But the requirements to me are just a little more straightforward in clauses 4 through 10. But if you're looking at some of the control language here, it might not be readily obvious what needs to happen to implement that control. So use this document to understand these security controls better, and also to train your control owners. So if you're on the GRC team, you're on the compliance team, your goal is to help the organization get certified, but you're not operating these controls. This is going to be a very helpful document to cover with those control owners to help them understand that this is what right looks like for this control versus what they may think right looks like. So this will help guide that conversation. Within this, there are 11 net new controls. So this has been reduced down to 93 controls from 114. So a lot of the controls that were previously mentioned in the 2013 version have been condensed into a single control. And on top of that, there's been 11 new controls added. So that's the other thing to just keep in mind. We'll talk more about this in a minute. But the other thing to keep in mind is if you have done the work of implementing the 2013 Annex A controls, you've not wasted any effort or time. You're just going to be building onto that a little bit more. So, all right. The other thing I'll mention is you are technically getting certified against 27001. So there's a misconception sometimes that I run into with folks where they think they're getting certified against the 27002 controls because you happen to spend a lot of your audit time looking at those because there's so many. But technically, you're getting certified against 27001. The 27002 controls or the Annex A controls is just your selected security control set. From a technical perspective, you could use any control set that you wanted to supplement the risk identified in Clause 6. But most businesses just go with the Annex A controls because they're pretty well written, pretty well thought out, and you have a lot of good guidance at your fingertips. So when you get your certification, just know it's going to say 27001. 27002 is not a certifiable standard. It's just simply guidance on implementation of the controls. So clauses 4 through 10 is broken down here. It's basically 7 sections that make up the sort of elements or the structure of the Information Security Management System, the ISMS. Clause 4 is, the other thing I'll mention about ISO, it's written a lot of times in chronological order. So to an extent, this is the order in which you should think about building the program. Start with 4, then go to 5, then go to 6, right? So it's built that way intentionally. You can obviously jump around a little bit, but if you're just getting started, I encourage you to read top to bottom and think about it that way. So clause 4 is where you want to start. You want to establish the context of the organization. What data are you securing? What assets are you securing? What is it that you care about the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of? If you don't know the answer to that, you should talk to stakeholders. Those could be customers. It could be internal stakeholders, executives of different departments. You could talk to the engineering team, development team. Basically, you want to understand what is the sensitive data or what are the sensitive assets that we're expected to protect or that we're expected to build a security program around. Clause 4 also calls for identifying who actually cares about it, right? Who are your stakeholders, both internally and externally? Who are the people that want your program to operate and succeed? And what are their motivations for wanting it to do that? So you'll want to document all that stuff pretty thoroughly. Clause 5 is building a leadership structure that supports the program. So if your program is built on a single GRC manager that's meant to just do everything, they're not having leadership meetings, they don't have, formalized roles and responsibilities at a top leadership position, you're probably not going to get certified. Top management is a formal term that ISO 27001 uses, well, a lot of the ISO standards use top management as a term, but it basically means the topmost representative who is responsible for overseeing the operations and ensuring the success of the ISMS. If you're in a very large organization, that may be, a VP of some type, maybe could be like a senior director of, governance, risk, and compliance, or senior director of compliance, right? Whoever is the one that is responsible, according to the organization, at the end of the day for the ISMS functioning. So whoever's going to be held the most accountable at the end of the day if it fails. That's a good way to think about it, and to determine how high up the ladder you need to go. So top management is not always the CEO. It's not always the COO or the CTO. It may be someone lower than that, but you need to make sure that top management has the ability to brief those other executives and those other stakeholders internally, all the way up to like a board level, on the progress, the functioning, the effectiveness of, and the health of the program. So establishing what that structure looks like is what Clause 5 is all about. Determine your leadership structure to manage the ISMS, basically. You also want to formally mandate or formally charter responsibilities for others. So it's okay if you have one or two people who are chiefly responsible for managing and overseeing a lot of this program. That's okay, but they need to be chartered formally to have the authority to run that program. And you want to, a simple one-page memo is fine. You want to make sure you take the time to do that, but that needs to be signed off on by top management and basically whoever has the authority at the business level to tell them that they have the authority to run this program. Clause 6 is made up of two sections. The first one is all about the risk assessment. So it's crafting a program and a design or an approach to assessing risk, as well as layering in certain tactics that will treat risks. So you will identify the information security risks to the business as a part of the risk assessment. You'll then work with the appropriate people, typically referred to as risk treatment owners, and you'll work with them to determine for any risks that are in their purview, what is the treatment plan. The treatment plan could be to mitigate it, could be to transfer the risk. Maybe there's a third party or something who's really ultimately responsible for that, and you want to contractually transfer the risk of that to them. Could be to share the risk. Maybe you have an outsourced development shop, but you have a developer in-house who takes their code and promotes it. You're both sort of sharing that risk in a sense. It could also be accept, right? One of the treatment options is to accept the risk, and that's ultimately where you want to get with all of your risk, is to an acceptance level. So you want to spend the time to assess the risk, to identify what it is and articulate it appropriately, and then you want to come up with an appropriate treatment plan based on the residual risk. So what that means is the inherent risk is what is the level of impact and the likelihood that this thing could happen. Mix those together, and what kind of a risk does that pose to the business? So if you use AWS, for example, there's a risk that AWS could completely go down and your availability could be completely gone. The risk or the impact of that is probably a 5. If you have totally built everything in AWS, it goes down, you have no recourse, right? You might have some things you could do to move to another cloud service provider or something like that, but in general the impact is going to be a 5. The likelihood maybe is maybe you say, it's a 1 because it's AWS, right? They're very reputable. Or maybe you've lived through things like 512K day for it was a well-known co-location provider, data center here in Atlanta, actually. And you've seen these very reputable entities have very big problems out of nowhere. So maybe you assign a risk or a likelihood there of a 2. So now you've got a 10 risk score, and you say that's unacceptable. That's the inherent risk. The residual risk is going to be what's that score after you apply controls. So once I do something about it, what is the residual risk? So if you do your risk assessment, you have residual risk scores that are still unacceptable, you need to further treat those in some way. Clause 6 is all about the program meant to do what I just said. You want all of your risks to ultimately be driving towards an acceptable level through the application of controls on top of it. Clause 7, the second part of Clause 6 is information security objectives and planning to achieve them. You want to make sure that you clearly articulate what is the goal of this security program and how are we measuring against that to make sure that we're achieving those objectives over time. Again, you want to make sure you formally document all this stuff. Clause 7 is all about support. What does the program need to function? Could be in the form of resources, money, time, tooling. Could be in the form of competence. Maybe it's training, right? Maybe certain people need to know how to do certain things. Could be in the form of documented information, right? The Clause 7.5 talks about sort of the policy of policies requirements, like how are you going to write policies? What's the process for updating them, for reviewing them? Where do they get stored? What type of format? Is there like common headings or like footers in those documents? How long do you keep them for if they get overwritten or a new version comes out? Like all that stuff is called for in Clause 7. So take some time and read through that. There's also a Clause 7.4 is a communication plan. So for any element of your program, how are you going to communicate out to some other party? Could be, the communication of your certificate award to the market. Could be, maybe for some special prospects or clients, you decide to share some of your information security policies. Maybe you want to show people your risk register. Like someone needs to determine who's going to be responsible for communicating any element of the program, and that's what Clause 7.4 is about. Clause 8 is basically taking the things that you plan for in Clause 6 and putting them into action. So all the stuff I talked about earlier with Clause 6 with doing the risk assessment is basically what Clause 8 is requiring of you, is to operate the things you've planned in Clause 6. Clause 9 is broken down into 3 parts. There's a self-evaluation portion where you should, as the owners and operators of the program, self-evaluate how are we doing. There's an internal audit requirement where you have to have an impartial, independent third party or someone within the business who is truly independent and not operating any of the program come in and perform an audit against a planned scope. So you want to have a formal internal audit charter that gives them the authority to do the things they need to conduct the audit. You want to have an independent party do it. It could be in-house, could be external, someone like Risk 360. And you want to make sure that you have an internal audit plan, which is a planned scope of what's going to be audited and when. And you want to stick to that plan and follow that. And then Clause 9.3 is the management review. That's where top management is going to be receiving the various inputs that they need to be apprised of status of how the program is operating and the health of it. And then Clause 10 has 2 pieces. One is how do you handle nonconformities? So how do you improve when things are noted as not correct or not working appropriately? And then Clause 10.2 is continual improvement. So one thing that you'll realize if you're just getting into ISO 27001 is one of the major themes is continual improvement. You want to always be working to get better and always build a more robust and a better security program that can further protect the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of data. All right, so I've got 2 slides here for the Annex A controls because I want to cover them for both, again, if you're looking at 2013, like maybe you're about to get certified, maybe you've been certified and or your company's been certified and you're just taking on a role trying to learn about this stuff. This is the 2013 version of the Annex A controls. There's 114 controls, and they're broken down into 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, I think it's 14 sections. 14 Annex A domains basically. So it talks about security policies. It also talks about the organization of the program. How are things organized? HR security, everything from screening candidates to employment responsibilities to terminations, right? Making sure that HR has controls in place to handle all those things securely. Asset management is everything from laptop management to cell phone management, server management, database management, networking gear management, software management, anything you'd consider to be an asset or a thing that is valuable to the business that typically that processes some type of data. All the asset management controls are there to protect those in a secure way. 9 is access control. That's everything from a typical employee coming on board and getting an email account, all the way to access to like source code, for example, or privileged access management. Like if someone comes on board and joins the IT team and they need domain administrator credentials. All the controls and access controls speak to that. They also speak to the systems that should be used to control access as well. 10 is cryptography. There's 2 controls there. One is the policy on cryptographic controls. The other is key management procedures. Believe it or not, key management procedures is one of the most common gaps that I've seen in ISO 27001. 11 is physical security. So that's everything from physical security perimeter. How do you badge into the office? Like, are there security guards or receptionists that are vetting visitors, screening packages coming in? Like, can someone that claims they're delivering furniture get all the way up into your office, or are there controls in place to check them? That type of stuff. There's also some policy requirements there around things like clear desk, clear screen, making sure you're not leaving things up and out in the open for others to see. 12 is operation security. So that one is really all about several different topics. It's antivirus, it's vulnerability management, there's backups, operating procedures, separation of environments is there. There's a ton of pretty bulky controls packed into 12. That's where an IT team is going to spend a lot of their time. 13 is communication security. That's also where typically the IT team or the subset of IT known as like network administration is going to spend time. But communication security is basically network security. Legal is also, believe it or not, involved there because there's some things around contractual language with service providers and making sure that they're beholden to some level of minimal security. 14 is systems acquisition, development, and maintenance. This is basically like the SDLC controls. This is what a software company thinks of most usually when they're thinking of security controls. It's everything from how do you make changes to systems, how do you consider security during the design and requirements gathering phase, all the way through to how do you do your system security testing prior to release, right? When you're doing UAT testing and things, or you checking for security functionality. 15 is supplier relationships. It's basically vendor management. So with supplier relationships, you want to make sure that you are vetting your vendors at the level of scrutiny that your customers or your stakeholders are going to want you to. So you need to make sure that if they're holding you to some security standard, that you're holding your vendors to an appropriate security standard. And the Annex 15 control set is meant to do just that. 16 is incident management. How do you report incidents? How do you identify them? How do you assess if they're really incidents? How do you triage and escalate appropriately? As well as how do you learn lessons from it? How do you index the data so that you can review it later? And also like how do you gather forensic evidence if needed for, like, maybe there's a criminal charge or something that's associated with an incident and you want to submit that evidence to court. Well, you need to make sure that you're maintaining things like chain of custody and that you're not resetting systems and compromising that evidence. So there's a control around that as well. 17 is information security aspects of business continuity management. So a lot of times when we think of this section, we think of disaster recovery and availability. We think of how do we make sure that our systems stay online. But this, the controls here are really meant to ensure that in the event of an adverse event, how do we maintain security posture? So this is a commonly misunderstood section where it's not about just restoring functionality at all costs. It's quite the opposite. It's restoring functionality within a given set of business requirements while also maintaining an acceptable security posture. So if your SSO provider starts having a ton of issues, and we've all seen Okta in the news recently, right? Like, let's say something catastrophic happens with Okta. How do you now allow your users to authenticate without compromising the integrity of the security controls you built with that SSO provider? There's a lot to think about there, right? Like, do you just give everyone accounts that just has username and password? Do you stand up another solution? What's acceptable in terms of risk to the business during that adverse event? That's really what Annex 17 is about. And then 18 is compliance. Do you know all of the rules you need to follow from a regulatory perspective, a legislative perspective, a customer contract perspective? Do you know the security requirements you signed up to commit to with customers? And do you have processes in place to make sure that you're following those rules? That's really what compliance is. Now, you'll notice a very big change here for the 2022 version. They have done away with all those different categories I talked about. Those categories are still covered, and I believe that category breakdown is a good way to think about those controls. However, in terms of how ISO has structured it, they've broken it into 4 groupings. There's organizational controls, people controls, physical controls, and technological controls. You'll notice that most of the controls fall in organizational and technological. So take some time, read through these. We're going to be putting out some additional guidance in the future on how to further break this stuff down and think about how to implement these control sets, because there's a lot of different hands in each of these pots. Just because it says people controls does not imply it's all HR's responsibility, right? There's going to be multiple departments involved in those people controls. Organizational, that's not all just the office of the COO. That's going to be a bunch of different departments operating those 37 different controls. So take some time, look at these. Again, I do think that looking at the old version and the categories is not a bad way to mentally structure how they're broken down. But this is how ISO describes it now. So go download the standard, take a look. Again, this is now the Annex A of 27001. You can download the 2022 version of 27002 to get the implementation guidance behind each of these controls. All right, so now let's talk about some common gaps. We do a lot of audits, a lot of assessments against programs looking to get certified. And we do all of that through our platform called Phalanx. And the benefit there is we can easily run queries against the data that we've collected to determine what are the most common gaps that we found. We do assessments in a very structured way. And so our developers can look at, the database tables and basically run queries to determine, the count of gaps against this control. So this is very reliable data. And we ran those queries, and these are the top 12 or so that we've pulled out of that data. So we'll start with the first one. This is probably the most common, because a lot of times we naturally build some or most of the Annex A controls into how we do business because we just know things to be best practices. What is not a natural motion is building a formalized governance structure. Things like a risk committee, things like a risk assessment group, things like, the top management review that has very formalized notes and agendas. Like, we're probably doing these things loosely, but it's not defined on paper and documented enough to demonstrate as evidence. So that's where you're going to want to start. How to fix it? We recommend forming an IRC, an Information Risk Council, and start doing quarterly meetings. Figure out who needs to be in that. It's usually a cross-functional group that hopefully top management can attend, and start figuring out what are the things that these groups need to know to operate this program effectively. The next one is missing policies. Again, a lot of times we're doing things in practice, we've just not taken the time to write it down. So sit down, write your formal policies, do annual reviews, and make sure that employees are acknowledging those. You want to finish the drill there by pushing those policies out to the organization and making sure that people are checking a box of some kind, or acknowledging that they've seen those policies. Laptop security, this is another one. So a lot of times people are given laptops with some controls on them, but they can be completely bypassed. So if you're an organization that says, well, we trust our users, everyone has local admin access, that's not necessarily wrong, but you need to make sure that you have an appropriate level of hardening on that machine, that you do have some level, some version of mobile device management controls, and typically some type of unremovable agent. So there's some unique solutions out there that do antivirus, they do like malicious behavior detection, they can even do like remote commands. And the way those agents work is you install them on a device, and it basically is installed in a way using administrative privileges to where it can't be uninstalled without some type of a master code that comes from the enterprise dashboard, usually managed by like the IT team. So consider options like that to increase your laptop security posture. Next one's SDLC discipline. I'll be honest, a lot of teams have no trouble documenting the process that they know they should follow for SDLC security. Many teams have trouble following the steps they write down. So spend the time to right size this policy, make sure that this thing is reflective of reality, and that you are holding yourself accountable to what you put down on this document. You want to have, if there's a checkbox that needs to be checked on every single ticket, make sure that checkbox is checked on every single ticket. Consider technically enforcing that it's checked, otherwise that ticket can't be, promoted to the next level, and that code can't be merged. Like, consider ways to make sure that you self-enforce discipline. We all love to move fast and break things, but we have to do this in a secure way so that you don't wind up in the news. Next is administrative access. So, a lot of businesses start small, obviously. Every business starts somewhere. And a lot of times as they grow, they struggle to keep administrative access scoped appropriately. A lot of people wind up with access levels they have no business having down the road. So make sure you're reviewing that administrative access frequently and you're keeping that list clean. The next one is sloppy onboarding, offboarding. So again, a lot of times we have no trouble writing these checklists and saying, here's the things that need to happen during onboarding or during offboarding. Following those though in the moment is a challenge a lot of times. So make sure that you have a culture of making sure that you're following the different checklists and things. If you have a system, HRIS system or a ticketing system that can notify people, remind them, help sort of reinforce this stuff, that's great, use it. Penetration testing. A vulnerability scan is not a penetration test. So a penetration test typically begins with some version of a vulnerability scan to understand what are the potential ways that we could exploit some things. But a penetration test, I would argue 100% of the time, requires a human brain to look at the landscape of threats and vulnerabilities and attempt to actually exploit them to determine how far they could get, to bring that back to a set of business sensible logic, right? So the fact that you have port whatever open on this asset doesn't really tell you a whole lot unless you're a super technical person and you just get the implications. A penetration test will say, yeah, you've got this port open. Because it's open, I was able to gain this type of access, which allowed me access to these resources, which by my understanding is something that I could take and exfiltrate and sell for money. And, you guys are getting a lot of trouble with your clients. Like, that's the difference in a pen test and vulnerability scan. So consider doing a formal penetration test. If you have the resources to do this internally, then hats off to you. Definitely use those. But if you don't, there are some very good firms out there that can do great quality penetration tests. We shameless plug, we have a Renegade Labs team that has been complimented many times on the quality of the reports that they write because of what I just said. It brings everything they find back to the business logic of why it should matter to leadership. The next one is vulnerability scanning. So A lot of times running the scan is not the problem. It's taking the tens of thousands of rows of results, digesting those, cutting out the noise, filtering those results, determining what are actual issues and what are false positives. Attempting to actually fix those issues a lot of times through patching, but then also revalidating through another scan that that issue was in fact resolved, which implies a lot of data work. You need to run the scan, and you've got issue A that crops up on asset A here. When you rerun the scan, is issue A now missing from asset A? If it's not, then whatever patch you applied didn't fix the problem. So you need to have a way of validating that you are truly fixing vulnerabilities, especially if you are getting some of these gigantic reports that I've seen coming from different vulnerability scanning tools. Patching is just, it's table stakes. You have to do it, because if you don't, you have an outdated patch or an outdated OS that gets exploited. It may be so bad that your cyber insurance decides not to cover it, right? Because if you can't demonstrate due diligence and due care for protecting your assets, a lot of those policies have language that protects the insurance company, because they want to make sure that you're doing your best to protect things before they pay out on some claim. So it's very important. You guys have to have a defensible approach here, so make sure that you're doing this. Next is vendor management. So a lot of vendors get reviewed during onboarding. Very few vendors get reviewed on an ongoing basis. I've seen that across the board. You want to make sure that you're not just onboarding vendors with risk in mind, but you're checking back up on those vendors on a recurring basis. Things change, right? Your business may be using that vendor in a very different way in a year or two than they are today. That vendor may be in a very different spot. They may have totally changed how they're doing things. They may have been heavily impacted by COVID. Now they're missing a lot of resources and their security programs suffering. Like, these are things that you're responsible for knowing. If you're sending them sensitive data, you're using them as some type of a sub-processor, it's your job to manage them to a secure level and make decisions on when you should not use them based on unacceptable risks. The next one's key management. I mentioned this earlier, but a key is everything from a certificate to an encryption key. Could be like a backup key, could be some type of an API key or an authorization token that a service account uses. A key is any kind of a secret, string typically that can be used to gain some type of access or to perform some type of a privileged function on a system. So you need to sit down and inventory all of the key types in your business. You need to at least be able to pull up a list that says, here's all the different types of keys we're responsible for. Again, everything from SSL certs all the way to encryption and backup keys. Once you have those identified, you want to think through, and ISO 27002 is a great resource here. Go look at the key management control there, but you want to sit down and think through the life cycle of each of those key types and write down steps for managing them at each phase of the life cycle. So everything from generating that key, bringing it to life, distributing the key to the appropriate people or systems, managing that key. If you suspect it to be compromised, do you immediately rotate? Do you check the systems? What do you do there? All the way through to archiving the key or destroying the key. So those are things you need to think through for each and every key type. And then the last one's incident management. You want to make sure that people are well equipped to report incidents. I've seen more times than I'd like to admit a very well-built program to handle incidents that had a very poorly built input system. So make sure that you are equipping employees and customers, external parties, with the ability to very easily report to you a suspected incident, because all of those triage procedures and all the SOC team things that you've got stood up mean nothing if an incident goes unreported. Yes, we have a lot of automated tools that can help us find out about incidents as they're occurring. There's a ton of great heuristic tools out there that can create alerts and send emails and notifications and things like that. But there's a lot of stuff they're not going to catch, right? Things in the real world. Hey, my computer's acting funny. I seem to be losing files and I don't understand what's going on here. that's the kind of stuff that people need to be able to report quickly. So make sure that you have well-built reporting mechanisms as well as a robust system to handle those once they come in. Write it down in a policy, build a procedure, tweak it over time. Make sure that you're also keeping a clean inventory of incidents. So not everything that gets reported is an incident, but when you identify something to be a valid incident, document it as such and keep that in a purpose-built system or repository somewhere. You want to be able to say, here is the list of incidents that we have, because you're going to need that for reviews. You're going to need that for all kinds of things. So make sure you're doing that. You're not just mixing it in with technical bugs and things like that. And then escalate as needed, right? Make sure you're escalating things as appropriate. All right, so if you're looking to get started with ISO 27001, I highly encourage you to come in to the phalanxgrc.com and sign up for free. This is a, I've mentioned this on every webinar we've done in this 4-part series. Please take advantage of this. It costs you nothing. It's very easy to come in, sign up, fill out a questionnaire that basically asks you all of the different questions against the ISO 27001 framework and the Annex A controls, and it gives you a report card with recommendations. So at a minimum, there's no excuse for not knowing where you stand against the standard. You can self-assess, get a report card, and actually start fixing issues. You might never have to pay anyone to help you do this. You might have to hire that internal audit function because you don't have anyone who's independent in the business. But if you're a 30, 40, 50, 100-person software company, for example, you're who we built this for. So come take a look at it, get the report card and start fixing the issues. If you need additional help or guidance, obviously Risk 360 is here. We offer all kinds of services around this stuff. We'd love to talk to you, hear about your problems, and help you guys work through them. So with that, I will take a step back and look for any questions that you all might have.
Well, we have 4 so far, and guys, if you have any more questions, please feel free to add them to the question section to your right of your screen. So the first one is, what controls are being removed from the 2013 control set?
Yeah. So there's none that are being like completely removed or deprecated. They're just being condensed and re-articulated. So I know it seems like, well, you went from 114 to 93 and 11 of those are new. Yeah, there's been a lot of condensing that's happened. ISO 27001 2013 had a lot of like very granular sets of controls that were really getting at the same topic. And so they condensed a lot of those down into a single control for the 2022 version.
Okay, our next question is, are there tools to managing your ISO program that you would recommend? What all should be in our tech stack to support this?
Yeah, so this is a common question that we get. There's a common set of like governance tools that you're going to need, things to manage your risk, things to manage your, general program inputs, things to measure your KPIs. Like those governance elements can be managed with a similar set of tools usually. In terms of a tech stack question, I mean, it 100% depends on your business, right? So what I can say is, like, if you're a software company, you're going to need some basic stuff, right? You're going to need some kind of a, dependable access management or IAM provider. I would recommend getting some kind of an SSO provider that can be integrated with most of your major systems. You're going to need some kind of logging solution. You want to take all the different systems you're going to be using to provide your goods and services and centralize those and make sense of those logs. You're going to want, all kinds of different endpoint protection systems, again, more logging solutions there, antivirus, any kind of like automated patch management. That's something that helps out a lot of businesses. But none of these things are like set in stone. Like you're rarely are you going to go find a control in ISO that says you must do this, and that means you have to go buy this solution. You can do all kinds of stuff on your own. You just have to determine how much of it are you able to do with the capacity and the resources that you have, and how much of it are you willing to trust a third party with. But yeah, I mean, you have to assess that on your own. And again, this right here is the place to start. If you say, well, I don't know what I do and don't have, come do this self-assessment. Come fill out these questions and figure out for yourself where your gaps are, because that'll help inform what tools you might need to start looking at.
Yeah, and everyone on the call, I've actually sent out a link from that question to answer with the link to Phalanx GRC. So if you're interested in signing up, just click the link and go ahead and get started. The next question is, are there any tools you can recommend to help teams gather acknowledgement from employees?
Yeah, so I'm actually starting to see a lot of the HR platforms support form acknowledgement beyond just employment agreements. So a lot of them are purpose built to, send an offer out to someone and they sign the offer. But they're also beginning to build in some pretty smart workflows around additional policy and document acknowledgement. So a lot of those HRIS systems have this stuff built in. The potential issue there is it's going to be managed by the HR team, and you might not have that autonomy that you're looking for to be able to push out a new policy, for instance. You might have to go through all their processes that slow things down. There are tools out there that are just purpose built for this, right? There's a lot of like training tools as well, where you can deliver some type of information security training, and at the end of it, it says, all right, here's a list of policies you need to click through, read these, and acknowledge it. But at the end of the day, I mean, whatever it is that you wind up going with, whether it's a basic Excel sheet that you maintain, because people are emailing you and saying, hey, got it, I'm reading that. Like if you're a 20-person company, that's manageable. But if you're a 2,000-person company, you need an automated solution to track this stuff. And there's a bunch of them out there. We have no like partnerships or like official sponsorships or anything like that with any tools out there. So I'm not going to like recommend a particular company or a particular software, but just know that there are a ton of options. It just depends on usually what other features and functions you want to combine with that policy acknowledgement.
Yeah, and also Sawyer, Phalanx GRC actually provides that as well. It's pretty built into our solution. So if you guys are using Phalanx, it's a good tool that also has an acknowledgement section. But I'll send you guys the link to that answer as well. We have two more left. One of them's around pen test. Well, we have two of them around pen testing. Does Risk 360 do pen testing? I think you covered that earlier. It was probably part of the question. And another one around pen testing is like, do you guys have any information on penetration testing and how it works? I actually sent the answer out for that one as well. We actually have two ebooks we published recently and a bunch of articles on the website. So if you guys are in the chat or in the question section, you can click on it and find it. But our last question, sorry, because I know I'm answering for you. Our last question is, it's from actually a student that just finished his master's in cybersecurity. And he's looking for more information on like what courses did he study if he wants to go into compliance, and also what certifications should he look to getting if he wants to become ISO certified.
Yeah, well, first off, congratulations on completing your master's degree. That's a huge accomplishment. In terms of certification, so it depends on where you're wanting to go. If you're wanting to go into industry and you're looking at, working for a company and helping run their program, you're probably going to want to start getting familiar with like some of the security best practices for cloud service providers and things like that. So there's a lot of like GCP or AWS or Azure certificates you could look at getting because you're going to be more tasked with understanding at least the context of how to operate the controls for the business you're serving. If you're looking to go into the compliance industry on like the consulting side or the auditing side, you're going to want to start looking at some formal training around how to conduct an audit. One of the certifications that I've gotten and that I recommend for a lot of people is the CISA. Certified Information Systems Auditor. That's a ISACA certification. You can go and buy the book and just study through that book. You don't have to necessarily go take the test right off the bat because you have to have some experience requirements to be granted that CISA certification. So you might have to spend some time in the workforce to be qualified for that. But the knowledge in that book can really help you build a common and authoritative foundation for how to conduct an audit. There's just certain rules and things you need to be aware of. Also, if you're looking specifically at ISO, there's two sort of routes you can take. One is the implementer route. So again, if you're wanting to learn how to implement an ISO program within a business, there's a 27001 lead implementer course and exam and certification. There's also a 27001 lead auditor course, exam, and certification. The auditor, again, is going to be more like, how do you conduct an external certification audit against a business? The implementer is going to be, how do I implement ISO within my business? So it depends on the route you want to go, who you're looking to, hopefully go work for, to determine what are the best certifications for you.
Cool. Well, thank you, Sawyer. We don't have any more questions. Thank you, everybody, for joining today.
Awesome. Thank you all very much. I'll leave you with this. The next series we're going to do starting in the new year is a series that's all about migrating from ISO 27001 2013 to the 2022 version. We're going to be talking about, we're going to be breaking down those net new controls, talking about considerations there, stuff you need to, consider as you're building those transition plans, new tooling and things you might need. There's, for example, there's actually an explicit DLP control now. Before it was just more so like hinted at contextually. And so, we'll talk through those things, those implications, timelines, resources, things like that. It'll be stuff that if you're managing a program, you'll definitely want to tune into that, because it's going to help you understand a lot more of the details around what you need to, brief your business partners on. So, all right. Well, thank you all for your time. See ya.